Should we talk about one of the other what one of the other leadership contenders is saying? If we can even call him a leadership contender, I mean, his polling is so poor. But Wes Streeting didn't waste any time after resigning from Keir Starmer's cabinet before calling for the UK to rejoin the European Union. Um, Partly, people might suspect that this was to throw Andy Burnham off a little bit, to get him to clarify his comments, to almost perhaps get him to say that he does want to rejoin the EU in a leave seat. If that's the case, he hasn't fallen into that trap. But Tom, what have you made of this return of the Brexit wars? 10 years on from when we
No,
voted.
exactly. Very close to the 10-year anniversary, isn't it? I think it's indicative of the fact that Labour has essentially given up on representing the working class. I think it's given up. It's finally come to terms with the fact that their new base is not to be found in those working class red wall or similar constituencies across the country, and that it is within the university towns, within the big cities, amongst the sort of middle to upper middle class intelligentsia, who are their new base. They're still a class party. It's just the class has changed. That is a recognition of that. I mean, Brexit was the thing which severed the long fraying tie between working class communities and the Labour Party. They clearly made their stand during the referendum. They clearly made their stand afterwards when they tried to overturn the result. And now this conversation about Rejoin is another symbolic reminder that that's really where their heart is. To a certain extent, this is about symbolism and vibes rather than substance. I mean, the way in which someone like Streeting talks about a customs union. I mean, no serious person in politics thinks that the Turkey model of EU entanglement is a positive one. Like the idea that you would just be a member of the customs union and that this would be, a positive economic vision for the country. But it's about what it symbolizes. We're these kinds of people, not like those kinds of people who used to vote for us and don't anymore. And I think it's on those terms that it's probably best understood.
Yeah, I mean, it does suggest a party out of ideas. I mean, they haven't been able to grow the economy. They haven't been able to, even though there are many things in place that are a result of Brexit, they've actually signed quite a lot of trade deals, which is quite interesting. But it's almost like the EU is the last refuge of the tired, clapped out, lack of vision politician.
Yeah, it's almost a sort of, I think, an automatic reflex for Starmer that, I think he probably feels, warm and cuddly when he's hanging out with European leaders and posing for a family photo. So I think there's a little bit of it, which is that for Starmer. But as you say, I mean, I think, look, the frustration with Brexit for the public is that the newfound sovereignty that we won hasn't been exercised to deliver the things that they care about,
Yeah.
right? Namely, getting control of the borders. And so you have to ask yourself, if as the Labour Party, they have absolutely no desire to use the sovereignty that we've won to genuinely deliver things that the country wants. No wonder they want to take us back into the clutches of Brussels, because they just, they don't seem to have any desire to actually exercise democratic self-governance, which is what ultimately Brexit was all about, right? And you see this throughout the civil service too. I mean, frankly, we've won back control over all sorts of areas, but many civil servants, I think would much rather we actually just gave those things back to Brussels and let the European bureaucrats deal with those things. So, I think that's the problem. And yes, I mean, I did also make me laugh with Starmer's big reset speech. You know, all he could really come up with was nationalizing steel and a European student mobility program. I mean, it really was the sort of, the last sort of vestiges of the Starmer administration on display.
And it does seem that the arguments for Rejoin are extremely weak. The economic arguments don't really add up. I mean, the UK has not underperformed its peer countries like France and Germany. Of course, it hasn't been stellar. No one would say that we're roaring ahead. Look at something like inflation. Actually, we've had less inflation than the EU since Brexit, or even trade. Trade has increased since we left the EU, including trade with the European Union, funnily enough. So it's not clear what exactly the rejoining the single market, rejoining the customs union, what rocket boosters of growth it's going to put under the UK economy. And I think people should be quite worried, actually, about some of the things that Starmer is signing us up to, where we are going to be rule takers and having no say in the rules on things like agriculture, fisheries, energy. Those are areas where actually we need a government to grab them by the scruff of the neck, where we are falling behind and they need serious reform. But instead, we're going back to the comfort blanket of the European Union.
Yeah, and the idea that the European Union would readmit us on the terms that we previously enjoyed is obviously for the birds as well. And also I take a bit of issue with the claims and a lot of the discussion that the public have completely soured on Brexit. There is definitely a degree of demoralisation, particularly amongst Brexit voters, because of the failure to deliver on, shall we say, the kind of broader vision implied in Brexit. That it wasn't just about the act of leaving, it was also about properly taking back control of your borders, properly reassessing the various ways in which EU rules and regulations had held us back and forging a new path. But Julian Jessup wrote a good Substack on this about the polling, because you look at the headline numbers, it's like, roughly in the region about 55% of people would support rejoining the European Union. But if you really dig down into it, and when the pollsters actually put kind of specific questions to people, you get very different results. For instance, if I think this was more in common, asked voters, do you want kind of freer trade with the European Union? Practically everyone says yes. Most Brexiteers would say yes, given the obstacles that were needlessly put in the place of trade by a very hard negotiating position from Brussels. But if you ask them, should we follow EU laws and regulations, it's a minority who would support that. Even Labour voters, it's something like 80% of them support rejoining the customs union, but it's a fraction, a sliver, I think it's in the single digits of them, who would support our tariff policy being dictated by anyone other than the British government, which of course is what being a member of a customs union with the EU would mean. So you layer on top of that the fact that, Eurozone membership, who knows what else could be added into the mix if we were to go towards rejoining. The idea that this is a kind of clear-cut case, that the public have just soured on the whole idea, I think is just completely for the birds, and it would reopen all of those deep questions about parties like Labour as to whose side are they actually on. Because one of the reasons that they managed to pull off that very shaky but nevertheless significant majority last time around was they managed to claw back some of those Brexit voters. They're never going to get anywhere near that if they continue to talk about this issue, let alone move seriously towards rejoining.
Yeah, I mean, they were at pains to say that Keir Starmer said Brexit is safe in my hands, and they adopted the language of Brexit, talking about taking back control. Whereas if they don't do that, then of course, it's already been clear from Keir Starmer's Brexit reset that they're, willing to go back on that. And I think also, it's worth thinking about how much worse the EU itself is, as well as the terms we'd be joining. It has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And some of the debates we've been having around something like net zero, well, actually, we might be able to elect a government that is going to water that down. But if we were in the EU, that's now an EU level requirement, essentially. Or if you think about something like the Digital Services Act, which means that we would have online censorship baked into any European Union agreement. That's quite terrifying. And I think if we had that debate, then I think you see the numbers for any enthusiasm for rejoining dissipate, apart from among the hardcore Remain bloc.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think also that the point on economic performance is really worth stressing. Right? I was a Brexiteer. I was a quiet one because I was a civil servant at the time. But
can't voice that.
No, indeed, and I would probably be bullied if I'd admitted it. But the point is that I do remember back then I did take seriously the some of the fear mongering that the Remain side were pushing, because anyone who's serious about the economy and economic performance and wanting our country to be credible as an economic power, of course, is going to be sort of concerned about some of these arguments that our economy would take a hammering. And actually, none of it really has come to pass. The growth we have in this country is paltry, but Germany and France are growing even more slowly. And actually, if you look at the data, Brexit doesn't show up at all in the data. It's basically invisible. So, yes, our economy is trundling along very slowly, and there's all sorts of things going wrong there. But Brexit isn't the cause of that.
And as far as I can tell from really trying hard to understand the Remain argument, it's basically, and weirdly, this is coming from Labour people, like Ben Judah, for instance, has been on a bit of a warpath, making the Remain case or Rejoin case on Twitter. He's David Lammy's former special advisor. It seems to be that the economy was going absolute gangbusters around 2014, 2015, and we were on a path to basically not only overtake our peer countries like France and Germany, but to essentially be outgrowing the United States. And what are they saying? That George Osborne and David Cameron had wound up with the absolute model economy and we screwed it up, and we should apologise to Mr. Osborne or something. I just don't buy it. That wasn't true.
Yeah. The argument doesn't, frankly, make sense. But there's all sorts of things that are just left unsaid by those pushing for us to rejoin. I mean, for example, the £25 billion or so that we would need to contribute to the EU budget. Where is that money going to come from? I mean, as it is, the gilt markets are having a meltdown at the level of debt we have in this country. So I don't think we can borrow that money. So what public services are they going to cut to pay for it, right? And none of those questions are being answered at the moment. So I think fundamentally it's quite an unserious position.